This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
I'm Michelle Franzen in New York with this ABC News Digital special report, Ukraine on fire. The clashes between the protesters and police so severe and creating scenes like this. This amateur drone video shows Kiev's Independence Square engulfed in flames. Let's listen in to the president.
And we have been deeply engaged with our European partners as well as both the Ukrainian government and the opposition to try to assure that violence ends.
Y estamos profundamente trabajando en un diálogo profundo con nuestros colaboradores en Europa, incluido el gobierno de Ucrania, la oposición ucraniana, para cerciorarnos de que la violencia llegue a su fin.
But we hold the Ukrainian government primarily responsible for making sure that it is dealing with peaceful protesters in an appropriate way, that the Ukrainian people are able to assemble and speak freely about their interests without fear of repression. And I want to be very clear that as we work through these next several days in Ukraine, that we are going to be watching very carefully, and we expect the Ukrainian government to show restraint, to not resort to violence in dealing with peaceful protesters. We've said that we also expect peaceful protesters to remain peaceful, and we'll be monitoring very carefully the situation, recognizing that along with our European partners and the international community, there will be consequences if people step over the line.
Y nosotros responsabilizamos al gobierno ucraniano para asegurarse de que los manifestantes que se están manifestando, protestando de manera pacífica, sean tratados de manera apropiada por parte del gobierno. Nosotros queremos que el pueblo ucraniano tenga la libertad de asociación y libertad de expresión sin temor a represalias de parte del gobierno. Y quiero que quede claro que estaremos trabajando en los próximos días para estar monitoreando la situación de manera muy cuidadosa, para asegurarnos de que el gobierno ucraniano esté actuando con cuidado, con atención, que no recurra a la violencia en contra de manifestantes pacíficos, pero que también los manifestantes pacíficos tengan la expectativa de que se mantengan pacíficos. Y estaremos trabajando y monitoreando la situación para que ellos, el gobierno y los manifestantes, tengan la certeza de que habrá consecuencias si no actúan de la manera apropiada.
And that includes making sure that the Ukrainian military does not step in to what should be a set of issues that can be resolved by civilians.
Y eso incluye cerciorarnos de que las Fuerzas Armadas ucranianas no intervengan en una situación en la que se puede llegar a una solución pacífica con los civiles.
So the United States will continue to engage with all sides in the dispute in Ukraine. And ultimately our interest is to make sure that the Ukrainian people can express their own desires. And we believe that a large majority of Ukrainians are interested in integration with Europe and the commerce and cultural exchanges that are possible for them to expand opportunity and prosperity. But regardless of how the Ukrainian people determine their own future, it's important that it is the people themselves that make those decisions, and that's what the United States will continue to strive to achieve.
Nosotros mantendremos el diálogo con todos los lados involucrados en esta disputa.
You have been listening to President Obama as he addressed the issue unfolding in Ukraine today. He made these comments, of course, at a bilateral meeting in Mexico. He was meeting with Mexico's president there, Enrique Peña Nieto. We want to show you some live pictures again back in the Ukraine at the capital in Kiev. This is outside the Parliament building, Independence Square. You can see fires still burning there in that square. This is amateur drone video in this area. Also some reports that 25 people have died in the last 24 hours alone, and reports of over 400 people injured as government forces have been moving into that square in the past 24 hours, they say, to move protesters out and to restore order. Of course, President Obama, along with other Western leaders, have been strongly coming out against what has been going on in the Ukraine capital over the course of these last 24 hours. These protests been taking place over the course of the last 2.5, 3 months in that area. Protesters are calling for the Ukraine President Viktor Yanukovych's resignation. However, Yanukovych is calling those protesters terrorists, having forces move into that area, saying that he will restore order. Just today, the embattled president replaced the army chief Wednesday, and the military reiterating again that they would take part in a national anti-terrorist operation to restore order. So again, President Obama, along with other leaders from France and Germany, coming out in strong opposition of what we see unfolding in these live pictures in Ukraine, at the capital, that's Kiev. And also saying that it will be up to the Ukrainian people to determine their future here, making certain that the Ukrainian government also hears that sanctions will not be out of line, as well as other consequences if people step over the line. Of what that might be still remains unclear at this hour. You're looking at file video now of earlier in the day of that square in Kiev. A lot of damage there, a lot of people still in that square. Many people deciding to stay there as forces move in. Again, President Obama adding to the international scrutiny and pressure on the Ukraine government to take measures to end the deadly violence in Kiev. The president saying once again there will be consequences if people step over that line, and he's also calling for calm, as well as other leaders in the West and along with Russia, calling for calm and for peace in that region. Of course, all of this is playing out with the backdrop, of course, of the Olympics still going on. And right now, we want to bring in Jim Avila, who has been traveling with the president. Jim, can you give us an idea of how things are unfolding there along with these bilateral meetings?
Well, of course, Michelle, this was not planned. This was not supposed to be part of this one-day meeting between the presidents of the United States and Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada. This, of course, is the events taking control. The president announcing this morning through his spokesman that he would be addressing the issue of Ukraine with the other leaders and then to the public, which he has just done and which we just saw. It's kind of on a two-track thing going on right now. The president of the United States warning both sides, but especially speaking to the government in Ukraine, that if they step over the line, there will be consequences. He didn't say what the consequences would be, but in the background, his people, the National Security Council, did brief reporters on the plane from the United States to Mexico and talked about sanctions, saying that sanctions against Ukraine were in the full toolkit of the things that the United States would participate and would do if things got out of control. And then Secretary of State John Kerry overseas in Paris saying today that sanctions are in fact in order and that will be discussed with Europe, the European leaders, to sanction the Ukrainian government if the violence does not stop. So while the president did not mention sanctions specifically, his people, including those in the National Security Council and the Secretary of State, are in fact mentioning and saying out loud that there could be sanctions against the state of Ukraine for what's going on, and that what they hope they're doing, according to Secretary of State Kerry, is by mentioning and threatening, in fact, sanctions, that it will, quote-unquote, change the environment in the Ukraine, calm things down, let the Ukrainian government know that there could be consequences, as the president said.
Jim, we're watching as we see these images unfold over the last 24 hours. Obviously, the president's been watching that or has been briefed on that as well. Was he forced to make a statement like this, especially on the heels of hearing from Secretary of State Kerry earlier today?
I think he wanted to. Was he forced? He was certainly by events. It was not on the agenda for this trilateral meeting here in Mexico. It burst onto the agenda yesterday, and then overnight, of course, Secretary of State Kerry began making statements about it after seeing what was going on in Kiev. And then this morning, when the president got on the plane to leave from Washington, D.C. To Mexico, his aides did in fact say, Jay Carney, the press secretary, told reporters that the president would be talking to the leaders here about this issue, which wasn't scheduled, and that he would also make public statements. There's also one more public statement the president is likely to make. There is a news conference later this evening around 7:15, 7:30 with all three of the leaders here who are meeting. We'll have a press conference, and they're expected to talk a bit about the Ukrainian situation as well.
Jim, I want to ask you about something. The U.S. was slightly embarrassed when a diplomatic phone call was leaked with some few choice words from State Department officials. Does the U.S. have allies if it takes this harsh stance?
Well, the Europeans are actually moving out front on this part. There are comments all over Europe today from all the leaders, from Germany, from Poland, from France. All of the leaders there saying that they were going to consider sanctions and that they wanted the Ukrainian government to know that. Remember, this originally began back in November because the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian parliament, had in fact voted to have closer relationships with Europe. And so Europe has been involved in this from the beginning. And it was only after the Ukrainian president put a halt to that agreement and said, no, I'm not going to get closer to Europe. I'm going to instead be closer to Russia, that in fact this all began and the protests began. So Europe has been really out in front on this. The United States says they're going to join Europe if there are sanctions, to talk about sanctions. So really, they do have allies. The United States does have allies. And in fact, it's Europe that is taking the lead, and the United States is behind them.
With Europe taking the lead on this, Jim, how much does the U.S.'s harsh words add to that chorus? Do they have a lot of influence?
Well, certainly the United States has a lot of influence, both among European leaders. It gives them the understanding the United States is behind what they're saying. It also, these words also give strength to those who are protesting in the Ukraine. Of course, the president did tell them to remain peaceful. There's some indication that the protesters last night began to not be peaceful, to in fact go toward violence. According to the Ukrainian government, they're the ones who are starting this. So the president was very careful to say that while he's speaking to the Ukrainian government, and they have the ultimate responsibility of making sure that this is a peaceful resolution done by the civilian part of the government and not by the military, there were also warnings to the protesters to stay peaceful.
Jim Avila, thank you. Traveling with the president in Mexico. For more on this, I want to bring in ABC News political director Rick Klein. Rick, it seems like this stance has some bipartisan support also in Washington. Is that your sense?
That's right, and I think that actually President Obama is a little late to the game when it comes to the harsher calls on the Ukrainian government to show restraint. We've heard Republican senators for the better part of the last couple of days, maybe upwards of a week, encouraging the administration to get more involved, to take a harder line, to make clear that this cannot be acceptable behavior as far as the United States is concerned. Of course, there's a Russian relationship that is very front and center through all of this. In the middle of the Sochi Olympics, Russia is so important to not just the Ukraine situation, but also what's going on right now in Syria and in the broader Middle East. So the Russian relationship, very important here. But yes, I think it's fair to say that the president, with his announcement today, has bipartisan support back home in Washington.
You know, Rick, the president coming out with very harsh words today, very hardline stance. But you mentioned that you say he's pretty late to the game here. Of course, these protests have been taking place for over 2.5 months, escalating to what we see on these live pictures in the last 24 hours. Why do you think it took President Obama so long to react to this?
In part, this Obama White House has been burned by getting involved in things a little too soon, and I think the experience with the Arab Spring probably bears that out. I think in addition to that, the White House has to be careful in terms of how they respond, when they respond. They want to be very specific that this is about the Ukrainian government and to the extent you hold them responsible. There are people all over the world all the time who are upset at their government, and they have all kinds of crackdowns that are around it. That's not enough to merit a presidential response except in really extraordinary circumstances. So you don't want to look like like you're meddling in internal politics. And I think you get a lot of pushback from Ukrainian leaders if you do that. I think the White House preference here was to try to deal with this through back channels. We know about a call that the Vice President Biden made just yesterday to the president of Ukraine to try to make the same kind of encouragement. It's only when that doesn't seem to be working, when the message isn't being heard, that the president has to go out. And I think today's statement was unusual in its bluntness. It was very clear as to, in saying publicly, what exactly the government has to do, and that the United States would be watching and would be reacting to it. And the very explicit threat of sanctions as response, or maybe more than that, I think is part of what the president was trying to convey.
Well, let's talk about that, these consequences. If the military does act, what would the consequences look like?
Economic sanctions are really what's on the table right now. I don't think there's anyone that's looking for much beyond that yet. It depends on how bad this gets. But keep in mind, if you start meddling too much in Ukraine, you do stir the Russian beast, and you want to be careful there. So I think this has to be seen in the broader context of U.S.-Russian relations, which, as I said, very complicated with a lot of different pieces. The United States does not want to let Russia exert more influence over Ukraine. That would potentially extend to the other former Soviet satellite republics around Russia. So they have to be careful about that. And I think they have to be careful about any kind of response here. We're nowhere near the calls even from Republican senators for boots on the ground, anything like that. We're talking about economic sanctions, which are important to the Ukrainian government. They want, in a lot of ways, to be closer to the West. They want to see the dollars from America and its allies flow as well. They want Europe as a closer ally, and that's why the message being sent that the Ukrainian government has to choose its actions very wisely.
As we see these images, as we see the violence escalate in Independence Square over in Kiev, we're hearing a lot of different labels. Of course, we've been hearing protests. We're now hearing uprising. We're hearing all sorts of labels. What are you hearing in Washington of how this is being characterized?
I think the extent that Washington wants to characterize this as protests, and that's where they see the Ukrainian government potentially overreacting. And I think that's an important distinction, that we're not talking about an attempted coup, an overthrow of the government. Once we start talking about that raises different issues for Ukrainian officials. And I think even the United States would recognize that if we're talking about outright rebellion and attempt to overthrow the government, that's quite a bit different. The president's statement, very clear. It wasn't supporting anyone who looked to change the government or really change big government policies. It's about expressing one's beliefs and in supporting support for free speech. That is a universal ideal that America likes to espouse anywhere in the world, and certainly anywhere in Ukraine right now. And that, I think, is where it's being cast. If it changes into something more than that, if there are indications, as Jim mentioned, about more violence, about attempts of something larger than just a peaceful protest, or even a slightly less than peaceful protest, that's where the U.S. has to be careful, because that's the kind of thing that you don't want to be meddling around in.
And then just one last question, Rick. I just want to ask you, as we watch these images, of course, we've seen all sorts of uprisings around the world in the last few years. We're watching these images. We know that there's fires burning. We don't know exactly how they've been started. What sort of information and sort of confirmed information are we able to get out of that region?
Well, I think Ukraine is actually better than in some previous circumstances. There's a pretty wired population. There are Western journalists who are on site, some of them actually in danger. There's information that's able to flow in and out of the country at a pretty regular speed. However, the fog of war persists in uprisings like this, even if they were on American soil. It'd be unclear exactly what's happening at any given time. So it's complicated. Obviously, civilians in danger. America has to be careful about protecting just American assets here, but also at the same time be speaking to the broader implications here, and that has to do with where the Ukraine stands with regard to the West, with regard to Russia, with regard to the United States.
ABC News Political Director Rick Klein, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And stay with abcnews.com for the latest developments on Ukraine and the rest of the headlines. For now, I'm Michelle Franzen in New York with this ABC News Digital Special Report.